Have you ever been ignored by someone who meant a lot to you? Not shouted at, not insulted, not openly rejected, ignored. Silence that feels heavier than words. Silence that feels intentional. Silence that leaves you questioning what you did wrong. You send a message, no response. You try again, still nothing. You replay your last conversation again and again, searching for mistakes, looking for something you may have said that caused this distance. Did I upset them? Did I say too much? Did I react incorrectly? And slowly, the silence begins filling your thoughts. Not because silence is loud, because silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates anxiety. At first, you may tell yourself that they are busy, distracted, overwhelmed. You give them time, space, patience, because patience feels respectful. Understanding feels mature. You tell yourself that everyone needs time alone, that silence is normal, that distance is temporary, and those explanations feel reasonable, comforting, reassuring. But over time, the silence begins feeling different, not restful, heavy, not peaceful, unsettling. You begin noticing that the silence appears after conflict, after disagreement, after moments when tension existed, not randomly, repeatedly, and repetition creates patterns. You begin noticing how quickly silence replaces communication, how words disappear when discomfort appears, how distance becomes the response instead of explanation. And this is where confusion begins, because silence leaves questions unanswered. You do not know what happened. You do not know what went wrong. You do not know how to repair the situation. So your mind begins searching for explanations. You analyze your words, your tone, your reactions. You replay conversations in detail, not once, repeatedly. And repetition creates doubt, not loud doubt, quiet doubt, the kind that makes you question your own behavior, your own memory, your own intentions. You begin wondering whether your reaction was too strong, too emotional, too unnecessary. You begin questioning yourself before questioning the silence. And this is where silence begins gaining power. Not because silence contains information, because silence removes information. And when information disappears, uncertainty grows. Another quiet shift begins forming. When you begin adjusting your behavior to avoid future silence, not intentionally, automatically, you soften your tone, reduce disagreement, avoid difficult topics, not because you lack opinions, because silence feels threatening, emotionally threatening, the kind of threat that creates distance without explanation. You begin choosing peace over honesty, silence over expression, agreement over authenticity, not because you changed, because fear of silence began shaping your responses. Another meaningful pattern begins appearing when reconciliation depends on your effort, not mutual effort. Your effort. You send messages, you apologize, you attempt to repair connection, even when responsibility feels unclear, even when blame feels uncertain, because restoring communication feels urgent. Silence feels unbearable, heavy, unresolved. And unresolved tension creates emotional discomfort that demands resolution. So you take responsibility, not because you caused harm, because silence created pressure, and pressure demands action. Another powerful shift begins forming when silence becomes predictable, not random, strategic, appearing after disagreement, appearing after boundary setting, appearing after moments when you express discomfort. You begin noticing the timing, the repetition, the pattern. And once repetition becomes visible, a deeper question begins forming. Not, why are they silent? But why does silence feel like punishment? Because punishment does not always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks quiet, controlled, intentional. And this is where silence begins revealing itself, not as distance, but as control. Control that does not require shouting. Control that does not require threats. Control that operates through absence, through withdrawal, through emotional distance. And once silence becomes a tool, power begins shifting, not visibly, emotionally. You begin fearing distance, fearing disconnection, fearing abandonment. And fear creates compliance, not forced compliance, emotional compliance, the kind that makes you adjust before conflict even begins. And this is where the deeper patterns begin forming, not through loud arguments, through quiet withdrawal, through repeated silence. That slowly reshapes how you speak, how you react, how you express yourself. And once silence begins shaping behavior, recognition becomes necessary, because silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is strategy. And once strategy becomes visible, understanding begins forming. Understanding that silence may not be peace, but control. And this is where silence begins changing from reaction into pattern, not random silence, predictable silence. Silence that appears at familiar moments, moments when tension exists, moments when disagreement happens, moments when something uncomfortable is said. You begin noticing the timing, not always immediately, but gradually. After conflict, communication disappears. After disagreement, distance appears. After you express discomfort, silence replaces conversation, and repetition creates recognition. You begin expecting silence, even before it happens, not consciously, emotionally. You feel tension rising before the silence begins. You feel anxiety forming before messages stop, because your mind begins predicting what experience has already taught you. Another important shift begins forming when silence starts influencing your behavior. Before conflict even begins, you become more careful, more cautious, more restrained, not because your opinions changed, because your expectations changed. You begin choosing words carefully, softening statements, reducing disagreement. Not because you lack confidence, because silence feels threatening, not physically threatening, emotionally threatening. The kind that creates distance without explanation. An unexplained distance creates insecurity. You begin wondering what triggers silence, what words cause withdrawal, what reactions create distance. And once those questions begin forming, self-monitoring begins forming too. You begin monitoring your tone, your reactions, your expressions, not occasionally, repeatedly, because avoiding silence becomes priority. Not honesty, not clarity, avoidance. And avoidance reshapes communication. Another meaningful pattern begins forming when reconciliation becomes your responsibility, not shared responsibility. Your responsibility, silence appears, distance grows, communication disappears, and eventually you reach out. You send the first message. You apologize first. You attempt to restore connection, not because you caused harm, because silence feels unbearable, heavy, emotionally exhausting. You want resolution, closure, understanding. But instead of receiving explanation, you receive relief only after making effort, after apologizing, after reaching out, after restoring peace. And this pattern creates imbalance, not visible imbalance, emotional imbalance, where responsibility for reconnection belongs only to you. Another powerful shift appears when silence begins creating self-doubt. Not immediate doubt, gradual doubt. You begin questioning your reactions, your tone, your intentions. You replay conversations again and again, looking for mistakes, looking for errors, looking for moments that explain the silence. And repeated replay creates uncertainty. You begin doubting your memory, your perception, your emotional responses, not because they were wrong, because silence removed explanation. An absence of explanation creates imagination. Your mind fills the gap, creates possibilities, creates fears, creates blame, often blame directed toward yourself. Another subtle shift begins appearing when silence becomes longer over time. Not brief silence, extended silence, hours, days, sometimes longer. And duration increases pressure. The longer silence lasts, the heavier tension becomes. Not spoken tension, internal tension. The kind that fills your thoughts, distracts your focus, consumes emotional energy. You feel restless, uncertain, unstable. Because unresolved tension demands closure, and closure feels unreachable without communication. Another important pattern begins forming when silence becomes unpredictable, yet consistent. Unpredictable in timing, consistent in response. You never know exactly when silence will begin, but you know it will, eventually. And unpredictability creates anxiety. You begin anticipating distance before it happens. You begin adjusting behavior to prevent possible silence, even when silence has not yet appeared. And anticipation creates emotional tension that remains constant, not occasional, persistent. Another meaningful shift appears when silence becomes more powerful than words. Not because silence communicates clearly, because silence removes communication entirely. You begin fearing distance more than disagreement, more than conflict, more than tension, because silence creates isolation, emotional isolation, the kind that makes connection feel fragile, uncertain, temporary. And fear of isolation creates compliance, not forced compliance, emotional compliance. You begin agreeing more often, disagreeing less often, expressing less discomfort, not because you feel differently, because silence feels worse than disagreement. Another powerful pattern begins forming when silence begins shaping your identity, not loudly, quietly. You begin seeing yourself as the person who restores peace, who prevents distance, who fixes communication. Not because that role was chosen, because that role was repeated enough to become expectation. And expectation creates identity, not true identity, functional identity, the kind shaped by behavior rather than choice. Another important realization begins forming when you notice that silence does not solve problems. It delays them, postpones them, avoids them. But unresolved problems remain, hidden beneath distance, hidden beneath silence, and hidden tension never disappears. It accumulates, grows, expands, until pressure becomes overwhelming. And once pressure becomes overwhelming, communication becomes fragile, not open, not honest, restricted, limited, careful. And restricted communication reduces emotional safety, not visibly, gradually. You begin feeling less safe expressing discomfort, less safe expressing disagreement, less safe expressing truth, because silence becomes consequence, not discussion, not resolution, consequence. And once silence becomes consequence, control begins forming, not visible control, emotional control, the kind that shapes behavior without spoken demands. And this is where silence reveals its true influence. not absence. Control. Control through withdrawal. Control through distance. Control through emotional uncertainty. And once that pattern becomes visible, recognition becomes unavoidable, because silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is pressure. And this is where silence begins changing something deeper. Not only your behavior, your thinking, your confidence, your trust in yourself. Because silence does not only create distance, it creates doubt. Quiet doubt that grows without explanation. You begin questioning yourself before questioning the silence. You replay conversations again and again, searching for mistakes, looking for something you may have done wrong, something you may have said incorrectly, something you may have misunderstood. And repeated searching creates uncertainty, not loud uncertainty, quiet uncertainty, the kind that lingers in your thoughts long after the interaction ends. Another important shift begins forming when silence begins changing how you speak. Not immediately, gradually. You begin choosing words more carefully, softening your tone, reducing disagreement. Not because your opinions changed, because your fear increased. Fear of triggering distance, fear of creating silence, fear of losing connection, and fear reshapes expression, not loudly, quietly. You begin saying less, explaining less, sharing less, not because you have nothing to say, because speaking feels risky, and risk creates hesitation. You begin hesitating before expressing discomfort, before sharing frustration, before setting boundaries. Not because boundaries are wrong, because boundaries may lead to silence. And silence feels like punishment, not physical punishment, emotional punishment. The kind that creates isolation without explanation. Another subtle shift begins appearing when silence begins shaping your emotional reactions. You feel tension, even when communication resumes, not because conflict is present, because uncertainty remains. You wonder whether silence will return, whether disagreement will trigger distance again, whether honesty will create withdrawal. And anticipation creates anxiety, not temporary anxiety. Ongoing anxiety, the kind that stays quietly beneath your reactions. Another meaningful pattern begins forming when you begin apologizing, even when responsibility feels unclear. Not because you know you caused harm, because silence created pressure. Pressure to restore connection, pressure to end distance, pressure to bring communication back. An apology feels like solution, even when explanation never occurred. You apologize to restore peace, not to resolve truth, to restore communication. And repeated apology creates imbalance, not visible imbalance, internal imbalance, where responsibility shifts towards you, even when fault remains unclear. Another powerful shift appears when silence begins affecting how you see yourself. Not immediately, gradually. You begin questioning your reactions, your emotions, your responses. You begin wondering whether your feelings were too strong, too unnecessary, too exaggerated. And repeated questioning creates insecurity, not because you lacked clarity, because silence removed reassurance, removed communication, removed understanding, and absence of understanding creates confusion. Another important pattern begins forming when your confidence begins shrinking. Not dramatically, quietly. You begin doubting your intuition, second-guessing your perception, minimizing your reactions, not because they were wrong, because silence made them feel wrong. You begin trusting others' reactions more than your own feelings, and trust shifts outward instead of inward. Another subtle shift begins appearing when you begin fearing emotional distance more than emotional truth. You avoid difficult conversations, avoid disagreement, avoid uncomfortable topics, not because avoidance feels right, because silence feels worse, heavier, more painful, more uncertain, and avoidance creates silence. Before silence even begins, you silence yourself to prevent being silenced by others, not consciously, automatically. Another meaningful pattern begins forming when you begin feeling responsible for restoring emotional stability, not shared stability, personal stability. You feel responsible for reconnecting, for repairing, for preventing distance, not because responsibility was assigned, because silence created expectation, and expectation created habit. Another powerful realization begins forming when you recognize how silence creates imbalance without visible conflict. No shouting, no insults, no visible aggression, just distance, withdrawal, emotional absence. And absence becomes influence, not visible influence. Psychological influence, the kind that reshapes behavior without spoken commands. You begin adjusting yourself before silence appears, reducing honesty, reducing expression, reducing authenticity, not because authenticity disappeared, because safety became uncertain. Another important shift begins forming when emotional safety begins fading, not completely, gradually. You begin feeling less comfortable expressing disagreement, less confident sharing discomfort, less willing to challenge behavior, not because disagreement is dangerous, because silence feels dangerous. And perceived danger reshapes reactions, even when real danger does not exist. Another powerful realization begins forming when you begin recognizing that silence changes not only communication, but identity. You begin seeing yourself differently, not confident, not expressive, careful, measured, controlled, not by rules, by fear of silence. And fear creates compliance, not forced compliance, internal compliance, the kind that makes you adjust before anyone asks you to. And once adjustment becomes automatic, authenticity begins fading, not completely, gradually. And this is where recognition becomes unavoidable, because silence did not only create distance, it created self-doubt, self-monitoring, self-silencing. And once self-silencing begins, identity begins shrinking, not visibly, emotionally. And when identity begins shrinking, clarity begins fading, not because truth disappeared, because expression became limited. And once expression becomes limited, control becomes stronger, not through force, through silence. And this is where the final recognition begins forming, not about them, about the pattern, understanding that silence did not only create distance, it reshaped how you saw yourself. And once that realization appears, the final shift becomes possible, not resistance, not confrontation, reclaiming your voice. And this is where the most important shift begins, not in their silence, in your response to it. Because once silence becomes visible as a pattern, it begins losing its mystery. You begin seeing it differently, not as confusion, not as accident, as behavior. Repeated behavior, predictable behavior, that follows familiar moments. Moments when tension appears, moments when disagreement exists, moments when boundaries are spoken. And once you recognize the pattern, something inside you begins settling, not because silence disappears, because uncertainty begins fading. You begin understanding that silence is not always space, not always rest, not always distance for reflection. Sometimes silence is withdrawal, intentional withdrawal, emotional withdrawal, used to create pressure, and understanding changes how silence feels. not harmless, not neutral, informative. You begin observing instead of reacting. Instead of rushing to fix the distance, you pause. Instead of apologizing immediately, you reflect. Instead of blaming yourself, you question the pattern. And that shift changes everything. Because silence loses power when it no longer creates panic. Another important shift begins forming when you allow silence to exist without chasing it, without filling it, without fixing it. You begin noticing how silence feels when you stop reacting to it, not comfortable, but less overwhelming, less urgent, less controlling. You begin allowing time to pass without immediate response, not to punish, not to withdraw, to understand, to observe, to protect your clarity. An observation creates strength, not loud strength, quiet strength, the kind that prevents automatic reaction. Another meaningful change begins forming when you begin protecting your voice, not your spoken voice, your emotional voice, your ability to express discomfort, to express disagreement, to express truth. Without fear of distance, you begin speaking calmly, directly, without excessive explanation, without apology for expressing normal emotion, not aggressively, respectfully. And respectful expression creates stability, not conflict. Clarity. You begin recognizing that silence should never replace communication, never replace explanation, never replace accountability. Because communication resolves tension. Silence delays it, avoids it, hides it, and hidden tension never disappears. It accumulates, builds, expands, until relationships feel unstable. Not because disagreement exists, because resolution never happened. Another powerful realization begins forming when you understand that your voice deserves space, not occasional space, consistent space. Your thoughts deserve response. Your emotions deserve acknowledgement. Your boundaries deserve respect, not negotiation through silence, respect through communication. You begin noticing that healthy relationships feel different, not silent after conflict, communicative, not distant after disagreement, engaged, not withdrawn after discomfort, present. And once you experience healthy communication, silence becomes easier to recognize as avoidance rather than peace. Another quiet shift begins forming when you stop interpreting silence as your responsibility. Not every silence belongs to you. Not every distance belongs to you. Not every withdrawal belongs to you. Some silence belongs to the person who chooses it, not to the person who experiences it. And understanding that difference creates emotional freedom. Freedom from automatic blame. Freedom from constant repair. Freedom from unnecessary guilt. Another meaningful realization begins forming when you recognize that communication requires two people, not one. Resolution requires effort, shared effort, mutual effort, not individual responsibility. You begin noticing when effort feels one-sided, when repair feels one-sided, when reconciliation depends only on you. And recognition creates boundaries, not harsh boundaries, clear boundaries, the kind that protect communication instead of chasing silence. Another powerful shift appears when you stop fearing silence as much as before. Not because silence feels comfortable, because silence no longer feels controlling. You begin trusting your voice, even when distance exists. You begin trusting your perception, even when explanation is absent. You begin trusting your boundaries, even when reaction feels uncertain. And trust creates stability, not visible stability, internal stability, the kind that protects clarity during uncertainty. Another important realization begins forming when you understand that emotional control survives only when it remains unrecognized, when patterns remain invisible, when silence remains unquestioned. But once recognition appears, patterns weaken, not instantly, gradually, because behavior changes, not dramatically, quietly. You begin responding differently, waiting longer, speaking clearly, refusing to chase silence with apology, not out of resistance, out of awareness. Another meaningful change begins forming when your confidence begins returning, not loudly, quietly. You trust your reactions again, trust your emotions again, trust your perception again, not because silence disappeared, because understanding appeared. Understanding of how silence influenced you, how silence shaped behavior, how silence created hesitation. An understanding restores strength, not aggressive strength, steady strength, the kind that allows expression without fear. And perhaps the most important realization begins forming when you recognize that your voice is not the problem. Silence was never your failure. Distance was never your fault. Withdrawal was never your responsibility, because communication requires willingness, not silence, not avoidance. Willingness. And once that truth becomes clear, something inside you begins returning, not loudly, gradually. Your confidence, your clarity, your voice. You begin speaking more freely, expressing more openly, responding more confidently, not because fear disappeared, because awareness replaced confusion. So, if any part of this felt familiar, if silence once made you question yourself, made you doubt your voice, made you fear expression, do not ignore that recognition, because silence loses power when it is understood, when patterns become visible, when behavior becomes clear. And once silence becomes visible, it becomes predictable. And once predictable, it becomes manageable, not through force, through awareness, through boundaries, through clarity.